we'll try and walk through three different items or three different developments over the last month. The first is a decision by the Canadian Supreme Court on whether GAR can be applied to deny tax treaty benefits. The second is this development on the India-US side on the equalization levy. We'll try and understand how the credit mechanism works, which is in fact not discussed in the India press statement, but is really as a part of the press release between the US and certain European countries. And if time permits, we'll quickly try and understand what is happening on the Shell Dutch PLC, the change in the tax residences. I'll start with the facts in Alta Energy. It's a case where there's there's a Luxembourg company which acquired shares from its related parties of a Canadian entity. This acquisition was in 2012. A year from the time the Luxembourg entity acquired shares of the Canadian entity, it sold these shares in favor of the third party. It realized gains amounting to roughly about 380 million from the transaction. The question really was whether the Revenue Authority in Canada, called CRA, Canadian Revenue Authority, can deny treaty benefits by relying on GAR provisions. The intent of the CRA was to try and tax this gain from sale in Canada. Before I go into the specifics, we can try and quickly understand what the treaty framework was, what the domestic law framework was. Under the domestic law, if not for the treaty provision, the sale of shares by Luxembourg or the sale of shares by a non-resident would have been taxed in Canada. However, under the Article 13.4 of the treaty between Canada and Luxembourg, any capital gains from sale of shares, the value of which is principally derived from immovable property, would be taxed in the source state, which is Canada. The treaty provisions say this is not very different from how you would have seen the Cyprus India or the Mauritius India treaty provisions, under which if there is a capital gain earned by the non-resident, India forgoes the right to tax, or under the erstwhile treaties, India gave up its right to tax capital gains and the right vested with the state of resident. If, however, the shares derived its value principally from immovable property, this income would be taxed in India. A further exclusion would be where the property is really used for the purpose of business, such as a mine, etc. In that case, this exclusion or this taxing in India would not apply. In summary, if it is a business asset or the business asset exclusion is available, the income would be taxed only in the state of residence, not in the state of source. You're familiar with this provision in the context of India, Mauritius, or India, Cyprus. The same analogy or the same logic applies in case of Luxembourg, Canada. If the business asset exclusion applied, the gain from the transfer of shares would be taxable only in Luxembourg, not in Canada. Now, what was the concern of the CRA? It said that the taxpayers acquired shares of Canada only a year before the sale to the third party. This entire gain of 380 million plus went untaxed. The taxpayer was a resident only in form, but not real resident. We'll go into the details of that in a few minutes. That the Luxembourg entity did not have any substantial economic connection. That is, it did not have any office, it did not have employees, it did not have a bank account, etc., for it to be able to avail treaty benefits. According to the CRA, if the benefit of treaty is provided, it would result in an abuse of the provisions, and therefore sought to apply the GAR provisions. Now the question is, when can one seek to apply GAR? GAR can be applied if 1, there is tax benefit, 2, there is an anti-avoidance or there is an avoidance transaction, and 3, if the avoidance is abusive. In this case, interestingly, the taxpayer did not contest or in fact conceded the first 2 points. It said that 1, I agree there is a tax benefit, and 2, there is an avoidance. In a lot of cases, you will see taxpayers skirting around that, trying to establish why and how it is avoidance. In this case, they conceded that point as well. So the only point left to the court to decide was whether there was an abuse of a tax avoidance. There was an abuse of the provisions. Now, what exactly is abuse? It's not a term that is defined in the law. Various courts there have examined this point and have said that if there is a transaction which frustrates or defeats the object, spirit, and purpose of the relevant provision, then there is an abuse. In fact, the revenue was of the belief that two sets of provisions were abused, one relating to residence and the other relating to the capital gain provisions. How is it really abused? Let's try and understand that. Article 1, the one relating to residence. Article 1 of the treaty would say it is the treaty provisions are available to a resident of one or more contracting jurisdictions. And Article 4 would say that treaty provisions are available to any person who, under the laws of that state, is liable to tax therein by reason of domicile, residence, place of management, or any other criteria. The revenue there was of the belief that these provisions relating to residence should only be made available to persons who have substantive economic connection in the state of residence. A mere formal or a mere legal attachment, just because you have a paper company, would not suffice for you to start claiming treaty benefits. They very strongly relied on the provisions of or the amendments to the OECD commentary in 2003 and the 2017 version. Article 13.4 and 13.5, which gives a non-resident a certain benefit, should be made available only if there is a sufficient economic connection. They very strongly relied on what is theory of economic allegiance. To try and understand the decision, let us break the views of the court down into 3 or 4 buckets, and we'll try and understand them under each of those categories. The court has looked at whether OECD model commentary would apply, what is the nature of treaty, whether GAR provisions, how should we see GAR in the context of treaty, whether these provisions of Article 1 and Article 4 relating to residence and capital gains have been applied. The treaty was signed in the year 1999 and came into effect in 2000. The tax authorities, in fact, relied on amendments that were made thereafter. These amendments related to tax provisions, the treaty provisions effectively said a treaty shopping is equal to abuse. If you shop for treaty, it is abuse. A mere formalistic legal residence would not let you avail treaty benefits. The court saw these changes as substantive changes and not mere clarifications of the earlier position. The timing of entry of treaty, which is 1999, versus the commentary existing at that point in time, which is the timing of treaty and the commentary at that point in time, was what they said should be relied on. If one went back and had a look at the treaty provisions prior to that, or the commentary prior to 2003, there was a viewpoint that these anti-abuse provisions had to be ingrained into the treaty for these treaty provisions to be denied. They went by this Latin phrase, pacta sunt servanda, which is used in the Vienna Convention to say that unless there is parties in a treaty must keep their side of bargain and perform their obligations in good faith. In other words, a deal is a deal and therefore stick to it. They also looked at certain reservations by Luxembourg to the 2003 model commentary, to the 2003 amendments, and said that the treaty partner is not agreeing to the subsequent changes to the clarifications as well, and therefore the intention of the two treaty partners is relevant. In fact, they rely and make certain very, very pertinent, they rely on an article which has very strong views. That article effectively said that these modifications or additional points in the treaty are created out of thin air. It is a significant change in the relationship or the thinking that OECD has, on the interplay between tax treaties and tax avoidance agreement. They examine what is the nature of treaty, how is it contractual, that it is part contractual, that it is part legal. I will skip over some of the points and the details in the interest of time. One very, very interesting observation, and that may be relevant closer back home, is that the court tries and draws a distinction between what is immoral and what is abusive. They say that a court should not infuse the abuse analysis, which is relevant to deny GAR, with a value judgment on what is right and wrong. They should not see what law ought to be or what law ought to do and read it as is. They say that don't draw overarching policy and then work towards it, and say instead look at the textual, contextual and purposive interpretation. They say read the scheme in entirety, see what the thinking was at the point of time the treaty was entered into, and thereafter determine whether GAR should be applied. They have some simple logic to say why residence is not abused. An alternate possible language would have been possible to incorporate in the treaty. If the intention of the draftsman was to really not stick to the OECD model and the OECD commentary, they would have moved away. In fact, they draw out one particular article in the treaty, Article 28, which denied a particular category of companies in Luxembourg from treaty benefits, and say that Alta Luxembourg does not fall within that genre, and therefore one cannot seek to deny treaty benefits. If you are trying to exclude somebody who is not specifically excluded, you have to approach that with a lot of circumspection. It's also very interesting to note why and how the court says that Articles 13, 4 and 5 are not abused. They say there is no anti-abuse measure that has been brought in. There could have been various modes through which treaty could have been protected. You could have had look-through provisions. You could have had beneficial ownership. You could have had subject to tax. Right? In this case, Luxembourg did not levy tax on capital gain. This fact was known to Canada at the time they entered into treaty. However, considering the larger agenda of national interest, the need to bring in foreign direct investments, capital, etc., it was a bargain that Canada did, that it gave up its right to tax on source and said, if Luxembourg is bringing in money, this threshold I will not meet or I need not meet. That is how the court looked at the object, spirit and purpose of this particular clause. They in fact went on to say that double non-taxation and the ability for conduit companies to take advantage of this was something that was pursuant to a bargain or a negotiation between the two parties. In fact, it was a deliberate choice not to address such tax planning and give conduit companies the right to bring in money. One very interesting observation is to say that GAR is only to target unforeseen measures. A conduit company is something that is not unforeseen, and therefore GAR should not apply to such provisions. The court, by a majority of 6-3, said that the use of a shell entity in Luxembourg would not result in an abuse. It is not it does not frustrate the object, purpose and spirit of the treaty provisions. There are two ways in which one can look at such a issue. One is to look at the set of provisions very, very closely, read them again and again, look at it with a magnifying glass, in some cases put it under a microscope, look at it threadbare and isolation, each clause by clause, methodically go examine whether each of these provisions are met, not met. The other way could be to probably take 2-3 steps back and see the whole big picture, whether there is any kind of abuse just by looking at the larger scheme of things. The majority, in my view, used the first approach. The dissenting view by 3 judges was more to do with the big picture, where they said that the taxpayer really benefited from a mismatch in international rules and therefore was not the intent. It is an abuse. If you are looking at GAR, you look beyond the literal words and ascertain why what was done, why it has been done. You look at the concept of economic allegiance in terms of where all these economic activity is closer. If there is no economic activity whatsoever in Luxembourg, it is treaty shopping, and that is abusive. These provisions may not really be relevant in the post-BEPS era. It may be relevant up to such point of time that PPT has been entered, or possibly treaties entered post 2003 with some of the safeguards that the commentaries and the models have brought in. Post MLI, you may need to see this with a clean slate. This decision may not be absolutely relevant or binding. What are some of the key takeaways as far as Indian taxpayers are concerned? One, from an India standpoint, you look at main purpose test with one of the four limbs. You see if any of the four limbs are met. If yes, then it becomes a avoidance. It is useful to understand this decision is very useful to understand what is use or abuse. This law or this provision would not straight away, or this decision may not be straight away applicable to an Indian scenario. You may need to examine whether you get caught within any of the other three limbs other than the use abuse. You get caught within any of the other limbs to determine whether GAR provisions would apply, not apply. Nonetheless, the principles, if you're advising a taxpayer or defending a taxpayer, the principles around what is immoral versus abusive and the thinking around how GAR should be seen, that is, it should not be seen as an overriding policy, but you should look at it on a textual, contextual and purposive interpretation of the specific provisions, are all important principles that I think we could use as takeaways. You may all be aware, and during the last session I did discuss the change by US. US had introduced or proposed tariffs on multiple countries, including India. This tariff was suspended for a period of 180 days and was to end on the 28th or 29th of October. However, on the 8th of October, US entered into an agreement with 5 European countries, and thereby the tariffs were withdrawn, and a certain compromise agreement was entered into with respect to how DST or equalization levy in those geographies is referred to as DST, how DST would be treated. Now that compromise agreement has also been extended to India. There was an announcement by the government of India on the 24th. This suspension was to end on the 28th, 29th. There was a compromise agreement that was entered into between India and US, or at least a press statement made, saying that the principles of that are applicable between US and EU countries would equally apply here. A couple of points that may be of interest. One is the statement by India refers only to the equalization levy 2.0 and not the 6% EL levy. So the question around how will the 6% levy work is something that one will have to wait and watch. It also, the Indian statement, the statement by the Indian Finance Ministry talks about final terms of agreement shall be released somewhere around the 1st of February. Such a statement or reference is not there in the US release side. Now, what exactly is this mechanism may be of interest? It says that there is a credit mechanism. What we can do is to try and understand this with an illustration. Let's say that the start date is April 22. That is the period from when the two agreements or the process of determining how will the new mechanism work starts on 1st April 22. This will apply up to 24, after which Pillar 1 would be applicable. The framework really and the agreement between the countries is that once Pillar 1 gets implemented, these digital levies would be withdrawn. So the framework, we are looking at what happens during the intervening time period between April 22 and the point of time pillar 1 is implemented, and how the amount of tax paid during that point of time would be treated or provided as a credit for the subsequent period. The interim period is April 22 to March 24. Let's say the DST paid is a sum of $100 during this period. And let us say the pillar 1 amount of tax during April 24 to March 25, which is financial year, the first financial year after it comes into force, is a sum of $20. And in the subsequent financial year is $25. The amount on which there is a interim pillar 1 amount, which is computed as the first year's DST into the period for which the DST was levied, which is the period April 22 to 24. So the sum of 20 will be 2x considered at 40. You will reduce the total DST paid over a 2-year period from the amount of interim pillar 1 amount of 40, and the balance amount would be available as credit that can be offset against any pillar amount that is paid during the subsequent years. I will repeat. You will determine what is the amount of DST that the company would pay during the 2-year period up to the point of time pillar 1 is implemented. After pillar 1 is implemented, you will determine what is the amount of tax that is paid under pillar 1 for a 1-year period. Determine what the pro rata amount would have been for the prior period under which DST has been paid in India, and see what is the difference between the two. Assuming that the first year amount paid under pillar 1 is 20 and the pro rata amount would be 40. The credit that is available is the tax paid during the interim period between 22 to 24 minus the amount determined at 40, which is 60. So if there is a sum of 20 and 25 payable across 2 years as taxes under pillar 1, this credit would be used to offset 20 and 25. So at the end of FY26, the overseas entity this company which is paying tax would be entitled to a reminder credit of 50, which can be utilized in FY27 or thereafter. Another interesting development is the change in the residential status of Dutch PLC, popularly known as Royal Dutch PLC. I'll try and summarize this in as few words as possible. This entity is incorporated in UK and is a resident of Netherlands. Now the intention is to move the residents out of Netherlands into UK and align the shareholding structure, align to the incorporation structure. This is a recent press release by Royal Dutch Shell PLC, and as a part of this plan, they are dropping this term Royal, and it will only be Shell PLC. The stated reasons are manifold. It talks about simplification of structure, reduce risk, managing portfolio with greater agility, etc. In fact, there have been multiple exits, which would entail a significant payback to the shareholders. From what I gather in public domain, there is a significant tax involved if it were to be returned. There is a certain limitation in the current structure in terms of what could be returned, else there could be a certain tax consequence. Also, there has been a proceeding in Netherlands where the court has come down and imposed a certain level of reduction in carbon emission that Shell PLC should adhere to. One school of thought is the tax and or the requirement to mitigate some of the carbon emission norms could have played a role. There have been statements by the company denying that it is not for either of these two reasons, and it is for ensuring that people are able to understand and appreciate its structure a little better, reduce risks, etc. I will leave it to you to decide which one of the two buckets this really falls in. but I thought it is a development that may be of interest to you. This is not the first major. In fact, last year, Unilever also moved from from the Netherlands, its residence into UK. Interestingly enough, there has been an amendment that has been tabled in the Netherlands Parliament, most probably by an opposition member, to introduce a exit tax for companies moving out of Netherlands. If you change the residence, they say you pay a certain amount of tax when you are leaving Netherlands, subject to satisfying certain conditions. One will have to wait and watch and see if this proposed amendment becomes law and whether that has a bearing on what Royal Dutch PLC does. We've covered 3 topics, and the last 2 a little more briefly than I would have liked. The first one was on Alta Energy, which is to try and understand how GAR provisions would interplay with treaty provisions, and can you use GAR to deny treaty provisions. The second was the development around equalization levy, especially the credit mechanism that could be used for DST that is paid during the interim period. After Pillar 1 is applicable, how do you use the DST that is paid and offset it against the corporate tax at that point in time? The third is the development around the Dutch PLC and the change in residence from Netherlands to UK. And with that, I will stop and thank you all for bearing with me.
What I did was that I have tried to select some case laws. Some of them are rather simple. Some of them are a bit complex. But in any case, I thought that these would still merit a good discussion. Some of the principles arising or some of the issues arising perhaps are relevant for us as professionals. And therefore, I've taken the liberty of sort of putting 4 case laws together in transfer pricing. One is a case law by our own Karnataka High Court in the case of Cisco Systems. One is a case of Ahmedabad ITAT for Mission Pharma. One is a case for Chennai ITAT on Messrs. Light on Mobile. And one is a case law on Goodyear South Asia Tires by the Pune ITAT. We will go through these and we will discuss what the issues which arise from these. So starting the first one, which is our Karnataka High Court, which is a revenue, which is an appeal filed by the revenue versus Cisco Systems. Here the issue is, what is the requirement of the necessity of passing a draft assessment order in a remand proceeding. So as you all are aware that, there is section 144C, subsection 1, which says that, after the transfer pricing officer has made his order, and if there is a variation in income, then a draft order will be issued to the assessee, and the assessee then has the option to either go to the DRP within 30 days. If he chooses not to exercise that option, then the final assessment order under 143.3 is passed. That means the scheme of the act is to show that after a TP adjustment, the assessee is given the option to go to the DRP before passing the final assessment order. That is the scheme. The issue which arises is that while this is the scheme for the baseline case, if suppose you have had a draft assessment order, then a final assessment order, and then you have appealed against that final assessment order, and then from the appellate authority the matter has been remanded back to the transfer pricing officer. After the remand proceedings, whether the same process needs to be applied again, or is it that because it is remand proceedings, after the TPO examines the case, a final assessment order will directly be passed, and there is no requirement to once again go through the rigors of 144C1 and then see whether the draft assessment order needs to be passed. This case law is a procedural case law. It highlights a procedural principle, but I find this useful because often a lot of times TP matters are remanded, and after the OG is passed, a lot of times the draft assessment order is not there. And since this is our jurisdictional high court decision, perhaps this may help us in challenging the validity of such assessments after the remand proceeding. So that is why I thought it would be good idea to discuss it amongst ourselves. Facts and ruling are very simple. So the factual matrix of the case is in a very limited sphere. So as I said, so assessee is engaged in the business of leasing and financing. The original assessment order under 143.3 read with 144C was already passed for AY 0809. Now, at the time of passing this order, basically, the process was followed. The matter was referred to the TPO. The TPO then made some adjustments, and then a draft assessment order was passed, and then the final assessment order was passed. Now, after passing the final assessment order, the principal CIT also initiated some revision proceedings under Section 263 of the Act, which was then challenged by the assessee before the ITAT. So the 263 proceedings were also challenged, and the original order which was passed also was challenged before the ITAT. After the ITAT remanded the order, the matter back to the TPO, the TPO straight away then adjudicated on the matter and then referred it to the AO, who then passed the order under 143.3, and they did not again go through the rigmarole of passing the draft assessment order. Against this action, the assessee again preferred an appeal before the CIT, and they where they pressed this demand that that the assessing authority has failed to pass the draft assessment order. The CIT appeal did not agree to the contentions of the assessee, held in favor of the department. And after that, the assessee was before the ITAT, where the ITAT then, looking at the case laws, allowed the appeal of the assessee, and they declared the assessment null and void. And against this matter, the revenue was before the High Court. So here you clearly have two cycles of assessment. One is where the assessee went to the ITAT in the first instance on the original assessment order, and then the second round of proceedings were against the actions taken after the remand proceedings. So this is the very limited factual matrix of the case. Now, here the contentions of the assessee was that assessee said that, look, 144C has to be applicable for including any reassessment proceedings, including remand proceedings. It is not only applicable only of the first instance where the assessment is made, where the assessee has placed reliance on a couple of other case laws, primarily on them being a case law of Delhi High Court of JCB India, where a similar matter was argued on similar fact pattern, where the Delhi High Court ruled that the applicability of 144C was not only restricted to the first instance of the assessment, but it was also applicable to each such instance where the assessment has to be redrawn. Against this, the revenue highlighted that they looked at the wordings of Section 144C. Now, the wordings of Section 144C do use the words in the first instance. Now, what they have argued, revenue, is that because they use the words the first instance, okay, it was only applicable in the initial set of proceedings, and it was not applicable to the second round of appellate proceedings. Then they said that, look, in the remand proceedings, there was no variation which was proposed by the TPO. The TPO merely followed the order or the remand directions of the ITAT in the original assessment order. And they placed reliance on the CBDT circular of number 9/2013, which seemed to suggest that your draft assessment order is to be issued only in cases where there is a variation which was proposed. And a without prejudice argument was taken that in any case under Section 92B and 92BB, it was a curable defect, and the tribunal had erred in quashing the assessment order. So these were the arguments taken by the assessee and by the revenue. Now, the court, obviously relying on the extensive jurisprudence on this issue, first of all held that the issue is no longer res integra, that it has already been adjudicated upon, and similar principles can be usefully taken for the facts of this case. They noted that the revenue had misinterpreted the words in the first instance which were appearing in the section, to contend that after remand from the tribunal, there was no mandate for the draft assessment order. And they emphatically said that the requirement of passing a draft assessment order was mandatory and had to be strictly adhered to, irrespective of the remand order passed by the tribunal. So they were very, very emphatic. They said the law on this point is very clear. And at each instance, even in the remand proceedings, before the assessment is passed, for a transfer pricing case where the remand has happened, a draft assessment order is required. They agreed with the reliance of the assessee on the JCB ruling. They also looked at another ruling in CSAM India, where the courts have held that, again, it is mandatory for the AO to pass a draft assessment order prior to issuing the final assessment order, even in the second round of appellate proceedings. Now, this is a very important observation made by the HC. They said failure to pass the draft assessment order would result in the final assessment order to be without jurisdiction, null and void and unenforceable. In other words, they did not agree to the revenue's plea that it is a curable defect under section 92 under 292B or 292BB. And this is where we have a lot of implications for us. They clearly said that the passing of the draft assessment order is quintessential before issuing the final order, and breach of the same would result in the violation of principles of natural justice and making the order itself void ab initio. These are very, very important observations. Where we have had a remand case, or where we have had cases of, say, rectification or other assessment proceedings, there is often a tendency not to check on whether the revenue has gone through the draft assessment order procedure, especially in remand cases, and many cases where this point has not been challenged, which is why I thought that perhaps it is relevant for us as a group to discuss this and ensure that now we have a Karnataka High Court ruling. It is not a curable defect. It is straight away fatal to the validity of the final assessment order. And therefore, in our facts of our respective cases, where on remand the final assessment order is passed without a draft assessment order, this can perhaps be one legal challenge which can be mounted against that final assessment order. I thought that this was something important which I wanted to share. The second case is again the case of of the revenue. Again, in the case of Mission Pharma Logistics, which is again an Ahmedabad ITAT decision. Here the issue is application of APA terms for the year not covered under APA. Case law is simple, nothing major in the factual metrics of the case, but the implications are very important. As you are all aware that under the transfer pricing provisions, the law gives an option to the assessee to enter into what we say is the advanced pricing arrangement with the tax authorities. In that APA agreement, for a period of 5 years, the tax authorities and the India taxpayer agree on the basis of computing the ALP, either by way of a targeted margin or by way of a set formula or an approach as to how the ALP will be determined. We can view this something like an advance ruling which you can obtain from the tax office. Now, the issue which arises is that the APA is for a specific period. It is for a set of 5 years. And should there be an APA, whether what is the persuasive value or the legal value, if any, of such APA for the period covered either after the APA or for the period covered before the APA is the question. Now, in this situation, we have a case where the appellant had entered into an APA which period started from AY 1011, and in that APA a specific markup was agreed upon. Now, the assessee proposed that this APA which they have entered into and agreed to with the tax authorities from AY 1011 onwards should be made applicable even for an earlier year, which is 2007-2008, because it wanted to buy peace and reduce the litigation. So the relevant assessment year for this case is AY 2007-8, where the matter was before the ITAT, and the assessee said, "Look, I don't want to fight. I want to buy peace, I have an APA which has been agreed upon, and I am okay to apply the markup which I have agreed upon on this APA also. This may result in some addition for me, which I'm willing to make, and I'm willing to offer that. But I do not want to go ahead with the litigation. So the idea was whether the APA can be applied for a period for which it is an earlier period. Now, when the matter was before the CIT appeal, the CIT called for a remand report from the AO and the TPO, and it did not receive any response from them, and therefore it held in favor of the assessee and applied the APA for the relevant AY, which is 2007-2008. And then the revenue disputed this application, and then it was before the ITAD. The ITAD looked at some case laws and the principles and held in favor of the assessee, and they said, look, this we will apply this APA, and even for 10-11, for the period from which the APA commenced, the matter was before the tribunal for that year, and as per the prescribed procedure, the assessee withdrew the APA, withdrew the matter which was before the tribunal and applied the APA. Now let's look at some of the principles on some of these case laws which the ITAD has relied upon. So I've just attempted to summarize some of the case laws referred. Of course, there are other case laws which pretty much bring out the same thing. So in Tito IT Services India Private Limited, it was clearly mentioned that there is no impediment on department in applying the terms of the APA while considering international transactions in an assessment year which is not covered by the APA, subject to the principal condition that the nature of transactions should be similar. The same thing was repeated in Abicor Binzel, where they said where the international transactions entered into by the assessee with its related parties are similar, then where the assessee has entered into an APA, right, and the computation of arm's length has been settled with the tax office, they deem it fit to restore this issue back to the AO with the direction that they will consider the plea of the assessee, and after obtaining the report from the TPO, decide the issue in accordance with the law. Basically, here the remand direction which was given is please accept the APA if the international transaction is similar. In Warburg Pincus, they said that although the APA may not be of a binding nature for an earlier year, the APA is in the binding nature for the year or for the period for which it is entered into, but legally it may not be. But if your facts are similar and if the nature of transactions are similar, it certainly has a persuasive value. And therefore, you can apply the APA for the period for which is either before or after the APA. In Ranbaxy, it was held that even though the APA could be applicable for the year for which it has been entered into, but the principles laid down in the APA for the comparability analysis would have a greater persuasive value for the past years also if the transactions are similar. Now, these are important points which we need to think and pause, because there are a lot of situations where something like this can be usefully implemented. You can have a situation as is the situation here where the APA was entered into for a later year, but the litigation is for an earlier year continues to be pending, and assuming that we are able to show the similarity, we should be able to reduce that litigation even for the pre-APA period. Now, which effectively or directly increases the effectiveness of the APA. We can no longer say that the APA is only applicable for 5 years. We can definitely apply it even for earlier period, even without specifically opting for the rollback provisions. Similar to this is also an important thing where you have a bilateral APA. These are more where unilateral APAs were there. You have a bilateral APA, which basically means that the APA has been entered into between the competent authorities of two countries. Say if your related party is in the US, then the Indian government or the India tax authorities will reach an agreement with the US tax authorities for the 5 years of outcome of the arm's length range, and both will then implement it, one at the head office level, one at the subsidiary level. And therefore the BAPA process is also something which is available to the assessee. In a unilateral APA, the assessee, say in India, unilaterally decides the matter only with the Indian tax authorities. So even when you have a BAPA, and the BAPA covered one country because it's a bilateral BAPA, but you have transactions also with a third country, and the transactions are similar, and you are able to prove it using the principles in these case laws. You can in fact even argue for the applicability of the BAPA even for those countries where the countries are not covered. Now, now look at here. Here the period is different, right? In the BAPA, the period may be during the period of the BAPA itself. Suppose if you have a BAPA from say assessment year 11-12 to assessment year 17-18, you may have other countries with which you have had transactions during that period, right? So it's not even a different period, but it's just a different country. The issue which arises is therefore, can you use that BAPA as a persuasive value and apply it even for those countries? I think some of these legal principles do give that leeway to the assessee. There is a very good chance that you can use some of these principles about the persuasive value, about the fact that as long as transactions are similar, courts have recognized the applicability in other years. So there's no reason why they should not recognize with other countries during the same period. So you can usefully look at the applicability of the BAPA, and similarly are the things with MAP. For some of the period, you have had transfer pricing disputes resolved through MAP and not through an APA, and therefore even for that period for which MAP is put, you can utilize the outcome of that MAP for the other years for which you have the litigation. So again, I just thought maybe some good principles to look at, and see how we can make this useful in our specific cases. From here, I move on to the last two case laws, and both of these case laws pertain to management cross charges. Friends, you would be aware that management cross charges is a hugely disputable and a litigative area in transfer pricing. Just to step back and cover the issue on a more larger scale, management cross charges are, say in the context of an Indian subsidiary, the head office allocating certain costs to the Indian operations. The reason and the logic there is that there are certain services being performed at the HQ level for which benefit is being received by the Indian authorities or the Indian company, and therefore Indian company is therefore entitled to pay that amount. Now, of course, when Indian companies paying that amount to the HQ, the profitability of India is coming down, and therefore the tax authorities would want to understand whether these management cross charges were indeed required. Now, historically, the jurisprudence in India, the way it has developed around management cross charges, is that during the assessment proceedings, typically the tax officers will ask us for the to show the benefits of such services, how such services have been received, what have been the cost allocations, and there's no set formula. And as we will see, the contrasting approaches being used by the two, within the two case laws. Sometimes they are convinced of the management cross charges, sometimes they are not convinced, and therefore, in cases where they are not convinced, it results in a transfer pricing adjustment. So, what are those factors? What are those specific data points which the officers like to look at, and how does the tribunal or the adjudicating authority view some of that, is something which I thought could be again perhaps relevant for us for the next two case laws. So let me start with this light on mobile. Here the fact was that the assessee was engaged in the manufacture and supply of molded components for the telecommunication industry, and its principal related party transactions were import of raw materials like display window, keypads. So it used to make those components or molded components for the mobile phones. it had also entered into an agreement with its AE for availing various managerials for which it paid management fees, and therefore, there was a set of services being performed by the HQ level or by the HQ, and that cross charge was coming to the AE through this agreement, and the AE was making payment for those charges. But typically, what will happen is that in management cross charges, because they are relating to your operations, a more common way of benchmarking is that you aggregate the management fee paid, right? And you aggregate it with, say, your import of raw materials, and then you test the overall function using TNMM or using the profitability. And if suppose you are a manufacturer, in part of that as part of that manufacturing activity, you have imported raw materials and you have paid management fee. And after debiting all of these expenses, if your profit is comparable to third parties, then the implicit assumption is that these payments are also at arm's length, because even after making these payments, you are earning an arm's length profit. So in this case also, the assessee had done that. It had aggregated its management fee transaction along with all its other transactions, adopted TNMM to benchmark all transactions. There were some specific transactions which were benchmarked separately relating to financial charges and things like this, which does not impact their manufacturing function. What the TPO did was that it accepted the the TP study of the assessee. It accepted the use of TNMM as the most appropriate method. And the years in questions were AY 12, 13 and 13, 14. But in respect of management services, the TPO determined that no services were rendered. In fact, he refused to believe that there were any services, and they said that we will therefore determine a nil ALP of that services. That means you were not supposed to pay anything. And it was on the basis that the assessee did not bring any evidence on record to suggest that it was in need for such services from its HQ. And and also on the basis that therefore the AE also failed to prove that it had rendered such services. So whether there was a need and whether in fact such services were rendered, both the assessee failed to prove, and therefore the TPO said, look, I am disregarding this transaction of the management cross charges. Before the DRP, the assessee argued that it had filed agreements, it had filed emails, it had filed invoices, and it had demonstrated and justified the payment of the management fee. And therefore, there was no occasion for the TPO to take a stand that such services were not rendered. But the DRP upheld the addition of the TPO, and it went through the agreement and the clauses thereof, and they said, look, there are a lot of services being provided, and it is difficult to imagine that such services would be discussed verbally by the parties. And then it reached a conclusion that assessee had not availed any services. Now, here you have a situation where assessee has filed everything. They have filed an agreement which has laid down what the services are. They have filed invoice copies. They have filed internal email correspondence showing the involvement of the foreign parent in the rendering of those services. Yet the TPO and the DRP were not satisfied, and both came to the conclusion that necessary evidence, or it did not meet the standard, or the assessee failed to demonstrate that there was a provision of service. Now, before the tribunal, assessee and again the revenue made the respective arguments. Now, what the assessee said was that it's a well settled position that the TPO cannot question the necessity of incurring the particular expense or the benefit received by any expenditure incurred by the assessee. Assessee said, look, TPO did not dispute any genuineness of the payment. I have an agreement, I have an invoice, I have a payment. No material has been bought on record to show that this is not a genuine payment. And once, if the genuineness of the payment is not disputed, now whether I should have wanted to receive this service or I should not have taken this service from the HQ, and what is the kind of benefit I have received, is not the purview of the TPO. And some of the the judicial position in this regard is well settled. that the assessing officer cannot step in the shoes of a businessman and think about the propriety of availing certain services. So these were the contentions. Now, they also said that the TPO said that all other transactions were at arm's length, and it accepted my aggregation, it accepted my TNMM. Having done so, you cannot then remove like a strand of hair one international transaction and dispute it, because you have otherwise accepted my aggregation and you have otherwise accepted everything else. And then it also argued that even without all this, I have filed everything. I have filed all the agreements, I have filed all the invoices, I have filed email correspondences. So there is no occasion for the TPO and the DRP to raise to reach this conclusion. On the other hand, what the revenue argued is that periodical payments were made. Those payments were quite large, and they are without any justification. And also, they said that look, the assessee paid a separate payment for royalty. Now, it being a manufacturer of molded components in plastics, when it has received know-how in terms of the royalty agreement, then there is no question of receiving other technical services under management cross charges. So considering that it was making a royalty payment anyway, the management cross charges is therefore a fictitious agreement and a bogus arrangement, and therefore we will not allow. They also opined that the agreement was a very generic agreement. It did not outline the exact nature of services that would be provided to the assessee. They went on to say that the agreement nowhere says that if there is deficiency in service, the assessee will be then holding the service provider accountable, and that it will be there is a possibility of imposing penalties. There was no such clause, and they said therefore no third party will enter into for provision of services without such safeguards. So it was not arm's length behavior on part of the assessee. It further went on to observe that the allocation keys used in the agreement were linked on percentage of sales achieved overall by the group, and therefore the costing was not based on the services actually provided, and therefore there is no link on the quantification of service and the fact of provision of service. The quantification of service happening based on sales. I may have rendered service in one, I would have rendered a particular service in a year, or I would not have rendered, is of no consequence. Percentage of sales means it's like a compulsory recovery of expenses, which they said that we are not okay with this. And they clearly, categorically said that the assessee was shifting profits to its AE in the guise of making the management fee without any justification. They also said that against the assessee's argument that it had submitted a lot of documentation, they said that document evidences furnished were not adequate, or they were non-satisfactory to prove actual receipt of services. They looked at the emails. They said, look, the emails are very generic. The emails just talk about a conversation between the overseas offices here. The emails are not evidencing provision of services or the availing of services by the Indian subsidiary, and therefore there was no merit in arguments taken by the assessee that the TPO had made the adjustment on the management fee only on the basis of necessity of availing. What revenue said, look, the TPO is not only saying that there is no necessity, but the TPO has made a cumulative determination that these are all the reasons because of which the management fee is not allowed. So these were the arguments of the revenue. Now, what did the ITAT hold? What the ITAT said was that it again looked at all the evidences and all that, and they said that the assessee has failed to bring on record any evidence to justify the payment of management fees, such as technical specification of services rendered, who were the personnel who were deployed, what was the exact correspondence with the parties. In fact, some of the emails do not, even the email IDs also do not seem to suggest that they are employees of the Indian company. It is very generic. So they said we have got just some internal communication between head office and subsidiary, but these kind of specific things are not present in the emails, and therefore it does not meet the standard for assessee to show or prove that it had actually received the services. They said that the AO and the TPO have all the powers to examine whether a particular expenditure incurred was genuine in nature. So they said, yes, we agree with all the case laws, what the assessee has said. We agree with the case laws that, they cannot sit in the judgment of a businessman. They cannot, question the necessity, but they have the power to question the genuineness. And in examining whether the expenses are genuine, they can look into the arm's length nature and ask for all the related questions. So it differentiated facts of the case laws relied upon by the assessee, stating that the issue being examined was on whether services were availed and whether it was supported by adequate documentation. So they said, look, those bunch of case laws are not relevant here. Here, what is relevant is please show that the services have been availed. We are not questioning the necessity, but prove it to us that the services have been availed and that there is genuineness in this claim. So they said that payment of management fee was to be examined qua evidences without getting into the aspect of the operating margin earned by the assessee and the TP study maintained. Now here, as I had mentioned earlier, what the assessee said, look, I had aggregated my transaction. You accepted my aggregation. My profit after the aggregation under TNMM was meeting the arm's length. Okay, therefore, once that has been accepted, then you cannot take out one transaction and examine it separately. So what the ITAT has said that no, the payment of management fee can be examined vis-a-vis the evidences. And when I'm looking at whether those expenses are genuine or no, I'm not going to be influenced by the fact that my operating margin is met the arm's length standard. So in other words, even if your operating margin is met the arm's length standard, the examination or of whether the management fee was genuine or no is still applicable, and if I'm not convinced, I will not allow you that expenditure. They also said that the assessee failed to verify the correctness of the cost allocation, and they agreed to what the DRP said, that the allocation was largely based on percentage of external sales received against the group sales. So the allocation key was the ratio of sales. It had got no connection with the cost of the services incurred by the overseas AE to provide those services. So while it agreed with the assessee that yes, once the aggregation is accepted by the TPO cannot pick out the few transactions and apply a different method, but they said I can still examine the genuineness. So that's where there are two things at the same time. They're saying that yes, we agree with the basic proposition that once you've done the aggregation, we are not disputing the aggregation, but we are saying that the AO has the powers to examine the genuineness of the transaction. That power he can do independently, and therefore it upheld the action of the lower authorities. So here is a situation where assessee filed everything, but the allocation key worked against the assessee. So again, very important for us to know that when we are structuring or we are advising clients on management cross charges, if there is a logical link between the quantum of services rendered or cross charge and the cost of services incurred by the service provider, it would perhaps be a good standing. And in this case, and these are highly factual in nature, but the way the ITAT has approved, have pointed out that technical specification was not there, the nature of services was not specific, who are the people deployed have not been put in the email. So on some of these, if the assessees are able to gather the evidence, perhaps they have a more robust TP documentation and they have a better defense before the ITAT. Otherwise, it is likely that the ITAT is going to look at a lot of those things only on an overall basis. Now, in contradistinction to that, it would be interesting to understand what was held in Goodyear by the Pune Tribunal. Again, the same issue of management cross charges, the same dispute by the TPO, but in this case, how the approach was different. Let's have a look. So here the issue is for AY 14-15 and 15-16. Now here what happened is that the assessee adopted the cup as the most appropriate method and independently benchmark the transaction for their management cross charges. The management cross charges in this case was called as regional service charge and largely comprised of general administration, financials, sales and marketing, IT services, production and tire performance issue resolution, purchasing and materials management. Now, the agreement said that these are the 6 type of services which have been performed by the overseas office to the Indian subsidiary. Now, what the assessee did was it applied the cup method and it benchmarked the transaction and said that these transactions are at arm's length. Here also the TPO requested the assessee to furnish the evidence for the receipt of services and the nature of services, what is the basis of computation, and what is the kind of benefit which has been derived. Accordingly, assessee furnished a whole lot of documentation, agreements, cost allocation workings, breakup of services, a certificate from the auditor confirming the cost allocation. But the TPO disregarded the cross charges with respect to 5 out of 6 services. It accepted only IT services. And as I've shown here, the other services like general administration, financial, sales, marketing, production and tire performance, it refused to accept. It was done on the basis that he took the tack that there is no evidence of receipt of services. The emails which the assessee provided have only generic information, and they were only in the nature of exchange of information, exchange of inputs and ideas, and somehow the emails did not show receipt of services. They also said that it is a case where duplicate services were received by the assessee. Here they said that look, something on technical on tire resolution they have received, but there is a separate technical know-how agreement where also assessee is receiving the services. Here the assessee has received some legal services, whereas there is some legal charges paid by the assessee otherwise in the expense account. So they are having overlapping services, which is again not permitted. Since the assessee has received these services from other sources, we will not allow the services from the intercompany. Said that the assessee did not receive any benefit. Assessee failed to show any benefit from these services. And then again, it went on to say that there was no need for these services. Assessee failed to prove that it actually required these services or the expertise from its head office. And then a generic statement was made to show that these are shareholder services and therefore there is no charge which has to be made. Now, shareholder services typically are those services which are performed as a shareholder in their capacity as a shareholder. So, if there's a shareholder and they want to conduct an audit for the financial statements of the Indian subsidiary, then they cannot charge the Indian subsidiary with that expense because that cost was incurred in their performance of shareholder activity, and it was not in the due course of or in the course of performing any intra-group services. So he said that look, shareholder services are there under the OECD guidelines for TP for management cross charges. Shareholder services are not permitted to be cross charged. And he said that though there is a certificate by the auditor showing cost allocation, but the certificate is only talking about cost allocation. There is no documentary evidence. There's no other documentary evidence for establishing what is an arm's length price. So on all of these cumulative reasons, the TPO disregarded and they said, I'm not going to accept. Now, it is important to know that from a background, a similar issue arose by the TPO in the earlier years, that is AY 11-12 and 12-13. Okay, and the TPO resorted to that and said, look, in the earlier year also I have not allowed, so this year also I'll not allow. The DRP also, when the assessee went before the DRP said, look, similar and identical issues were involved in the earlier years. So in the earlier years I did not allow, so therefore again I will not allow in this current year. So therefore the assessee was before the ITAT in the current year. Now it's important to know that when the TPO and the DRP said that they had disputed these charges for the earlier years, for those earlier years, the ITAT had already ruled in favor of the assessee. right? So I have year 1, year 2. My current year is year 3. The TPO says, look, in year 1, year 2, I disputed these charges. Okay, the DRP also says in year 1, year 2, I disputed these charges, so I'm not going to allow. But for that year 1 and year 2, when I went to the tribunal allowed me these charges. So assessee's argument here was, if your reason for denial was that you have denied me in earlier years, I have already got the relief of the tribunal in the earlier years. So by that logic, you should also allow me in the current. So that is where this part of the factual matrix becomes important. Now let's look at what the ITAT said. Some interesting observations made by the ITAT. As I said, first thing the assessee argued, that they said, look, since the addition was made by the lower authorities on the basis that they had made a similar addition in the earlier years, then for those earlier years, ITAT has already deleted the additions. So by that logic, the same approach should have followed by it in the current year. So that means the AO and DRP should have taken cognizance of the fact that for those earlier years, tribunal did not allow or did not upheld the actions of the lower authorities, and therefore they should have followed the ITAT ruling and allowed them when the facts are similar. Here, what did the ITAT observe? The ITAT said, look, question of rendering services is independent every year, which has to be proved on the basis of positive evidence year on year. So merely because for the earlier 2 years I would have allowed, but because this question is whether the services are continuing in the current year, and the assessee has to prove, there is no automatic entitlement for the assessee to say that if I have rendered services in an earlier year or if I've received services in an earlier year, I will continue to automatically get the benefit. Every year you show that you have got the benefit of those services, and every year you take the claim. So the claim has to be adjudicated independently on a year-on-year basis. So, as I said, so just because you availed services in the earlier years would not per se lead to the inference that in the current year also you had availed the services. And that factum of availing services established independently every year. Then they also said, look, there's a one crucial difference in the current year. In the current year, you have changed your most appropriate method to CUP. Okay, and in the earlier years, what the assessee had done was they had not used the CUP method. They had used the aggregate method, what we saw in the previous case law, where they had aggregated the management fee with the larger manufacturing function and they had justified it. But in the current year, they decided to change, and they said that you have decided to change your most appropriate method, and therefore that is also one of the reasons why we need to independently look at it. Also made some important observations on aggregation. They said when you are aggregating 2 or more transactions, then excess of price charge in one transaction can get set off by a shortfall, if any, in the other transaction, and therefore its aggregation means you evaluate something on an overall basis. But when there is something which is independently evaluated, then even if this independent evaluation results in a shortfall, but there are other transactions which have excess ALP, you cannot set it off. Again, to my mind, these are some important observations on aggregation segregation principles in TP, which is obviously, always remains a matter of contention. So we have some principles being laid down by the ITAT on this matter. So having decided that, therefore, just because in the earlier years we gave you that benefit, you are not automatically entitled to, we will relook at the issue again for the year. And what they said is that when now we are looking at, we have to basically answer 3 questions. Whether the services were actually availed. If yes, whether the costs were rightly allocated to the assessee by the service provider. If yes, whether the payment by the assessee was at arm's length price. Now, this is what we have to determine. And this is something what we saw in the earlier case law also, that the entire issue was around, whether it was genuine, whether it was actually availed, what kind of documents you show to prove that it is actually availed. So there's an entire bunch of things which the assessee has to factually prove about the actual availment of the services. So taking up the first question, so we will go through each of this limb. Taking up the first question, whether the services were actually availed. What was the evidence for availing the services? It looked at the management cross charges agreement, which specified the nature and classification of services in detail. It also referred to the various emails by the assessee under each of the services and analyzed the nature of services referred to therein. See, you are seeing the approach is the same as what the earlier case the tribunal did. Here also they're looking at agreements, they're looking at emails, but here you distinctively see a lot more thoroughness of evidence. For example, the assessee has filed multiple emails for all of the services. In fact, for one of the services, it filed 78 emails showing the receipt and the availment of services. So more than 2000 pages paper book was filed, where very detailed emails were provided about each of the services. This is a detailed analysis as above. The tribunal said, look, we are in no doubt that the assessee did receive such services, because the agreement was very, very detailed. I have not put out all the details here, but agreement was very, very detailed. It laid down the services, it laid down the sub-classification of services. There were invoices, and for each of those sub-classification of services, there were emails which were very clearly showing that this is the kind of services which have been provided. These are the levels of people who have been involved. So looking at all of this, the tribunal reached a conclusion that yes, we are firmly convinced that this is a fit case where there was availment of service. Then the argument was of the TPO whether there duplication of services. So the tribunal tried to address that issue, that objection. The TPO had alleged duplication of services, as I said. Technical assistance was received under the agreement, under the management cross-charge agreement, and also a separate technical know-how agreement was there, where relating to the tire manufacturing, some know-how and knowledge was provided. Now, there also the ITAT referred to the nature of services provided under the management cross-charges agreement and under the technical know-how agreement, and it differentiated those on facts. They're very interesting because we have a situation where the ITAT is going deep into the nature of services which are admittedly technical in nature. It observed that more routine day-to-day services were rendered under the management cross-charges agreement, whereas the know-how agreement involved receipt of technical information, which was crucial to do the tire production. So it clearly bifurcated and said, look, I can have two types or two classes of information. One is the core knowledge which I need to do my production and my know-how, and one is the routine queries or the routine troubleshooting which I have on a day-to-day basis, which is more operational in nature, and that definitely can be covered by the management cross charges. Merely because I had a separate agreement for my technical know-how does not mean that I cannot avail any other services. So I think that is an important point, again, based on the wording of the agreement. And therefore, they said that there is no duplication of services. Continuing with the question, did the assessee then derive any benefit? Now, they said, look, we are in no doubt that you avail the services. The point is, did you benefit from them? Because the benefit test is also important to be proved. Now, there again, they said that assessee was the best judge to decide if any particular services were required for carrying on of that business. And again, it relied on the same case laws where in the previous case law, we saw the assessee relying on the case laws. And they said, look, the TPO cannot step into the shoes of the assessee to decide if there was any need of services. They said, look, we have proved the genuineness of the service. We have proved that there was actual availment. We cannot say that you are not required to determine what is the benefit which has been derived of the services. Evidence of availing services. That means once you have the evidence to know that the services have been availed, it forecloses any further examination by the TPO, whether such services were needed, whether benefit was received. None of those questions then become relevant. And therefore, it struck down this argument also of the revenue. Then the revenue had argued that the services were in the nature of shareholder services, where the ITAT said that this reference has just been made in a generic sense, and they have not spelled out clearly what services, which services were shareholder services, and they said that, look, we have already seen the services did in fact produce an effect on the assessee company and hence cannot be considered as a shareholder activity. So looking at all of these subcomponents, going, line by line and demolishing each argument of the revenue, the ITAT gave a very unequivocal view about the availing of the services. Very quickly moving on, we went to the next question, that having agreed that services were availed, whether the costs were rightly allocated. They looked at the definition of cost and the manner of allocation specified in the agreement. And they said, look, the agreement very clearly brings out that the assessee share in the overall cost is based on actual services provided and was not, sorry, there's a typo here, it was not on ad hoc basis. So again, the allocation key and the way the agreement is drafted becomes extremely clear, is extremely important. They said that the certificate from the auditor of the AE outlined the basis of allocation, and that allocation was in the basis of agreement, and that correctness was not disputed by the TPO. And assessee also provided a detailed write-up on how the cost allocation happens, if there is a markup which has been charged by the overseas assessee, how they have determined the cost, and all of these things were collectively taken together. Now it is important to note that if here also there was some basis of allocation relating to sales, but sales was not the sole basis for allocation. There was a reference or a linkage to the costs incurred, and therefore here they were not overtly perturbed by the fact that sales has been used as a basis of allocation. So there again, how you do the allocation and how you justify through your agreement becomes extremely important and will depend upon the facts of every case. The last point on this was whether the payments were at arm's length. So they said, okay, we have agreed that services are provided. We have agreed that the cost allocation was also very clear. The point which comes is whether they were at arm's length. Now here the case becomes a little more interesting. They said, we are rejecting the cup used by the assessee, because according to them, the cup used by the assessee was not the correct way in which they did. What assessee did was, it compared the transaction with itself and said that, I am doing cup. It did not compare it with a third party or an uncontrolled transaction. And that is where they had a problem. They said, look, while we agree with the claim of the assessee, but we do not agree with the manner in which the ALP has been determined. So the cup method is not properly put. The application of the method presupposes an existence of at least two transactions, a controlled transaction and an uncontrolled transaction. Under Rule 10B, how you are supposed to apply cup, you need to have two genus of transactions. Assessee did not do that. It just compared the transaction with its own transaction. It's like a mirror. It's like a circular reference. But they also at the same time rejected the TPO's ALP determination, because they said that, look, apart from saying that it is nil value, TPO did not say which method it is applying, why is it applying that method, and whether that other method, which is a residuary method, should come into play. So they said neither the assessee has done anything good, neither the TPO has done anything good. Now here the assessee had proposed an additional ground, and they said that since the TPO did not specify which method they are using, the entire addition should be struck down. And then after going through a lot of arguments, the ITAT said, look, if I do that, okay, I have no problem, I can do that. But then the assessee's method also is not being upheld. So, so if I accept this additional ground and I remove the addition, okay, only on the basis that TPO's ALP determination was not correct, then we have to restore or reactivate the assessee's manner of determination, which we believe is also not correct. So we are in a log jam now. We are inclined to accept the additional ground, but the effect of that additional ground is that neither assessee that assessee's method will become activated, and we do not want that. And therefore they rejected the additional ground. So what they did was, they did their own ALP determination. Again, one of the very different approach, because in most of the tribunals by this time in the case, they would have remitted the matter back for examination, and they would have either given an open remand or with some directions to see how the ALP should be determined. But here what they said is that we will ourselves look at it. And they looked at the cost allocation. They referred to the CA auditor certificate, and they said that cost allocation has been given. So costs of providing of service has been given, and they decided to apply the cost plus method and said that, direct indirect cost we will apply, and then we will see whether as per the cost plus method, the amount is at ALP. Now what they did was again, the cost plus method also requires comparison with an uncontrolled transaction. They do not have an uncontrolled transaction. So what they said is they relied on the range, the tolerance which has been provided by the second proviso to section 92C subsection 2, which allows a 3% variation from the arm's length price computed by the assessee, that if the actual arm's length price of third party transactions are within the 3%, then that much is permitted and there is no TP addition which should happen. Now, what they did here, they took a hypothetical uncontrolled transaction, which they said, look, any transaction will have 0 as the minimum value, and they compared it with finally what is the markup which was charged in these transactions. They found that the markup charged by the foreign AEs after certain set-offs were only about 2.52%. And they said that if I start with a hypothetical basis of 0%, to be the correct arm's length price, okay, of an uncontrolled transaction, the actual arm's length price is not varying by more than 3% because the markup was only 2.52%. Again, one of the very unique ways. It is an open matter, and if time permitting, we can always debate whether this approach was right or wrong. Because at the end of the day, they rejected CUP by saying there was no controlled transaction use. Then they themselves CPM putting an imaginary uncontrolled transaction. These merits can be debated, but here you have a case law where the basic proposition of acceptance of the arm's length price was accepted basis emails, basis agreement, basis cost allocation. It's only the way the ALP was put by the assessee were disputed, and they tried to do something on their own. So,
and the decision with respect to this Chennai and Pune ITIT is very, very informative, and it is very important for Bangalore because the only decision what is lying in Bangalore is Phosrock Chemicals, but still the department is not ready to follow that decision. Even though with due respect, it will be when jurisdictional tribunal decision is there. For not following that one, it will be a judicial indiscipline. But still, they are not ready to accept the decision. But this Chennai and Pune ITIT, it has add on to the strength to the Bangalore ITIT, and definitely it supports us, sir. And with respect to the first decision, Karnataka High Court Cisco Systems, it is very, very important where when there is a procedural error by the department, it cannot be just ignored by invoking the provisions of section 292 BB. It is not only procedural thing, that procedure will affect the jurisdiction. It will go to the root of the matter. But nevertheless, the department will rely on a lot of civil cases to come out of this decision where there is a procedural error. But ultimately, as held by Karnataka High Court, it is definitely in favor. And thank you so much for explaining very well, sir. Thank you so much. And we have one question, sir, from Mr. Ranjit Kumar. His question is it possible for ITIT to determine the ALP?
Interesting question. Determination of ALP is a fact-based exercise, and it's a subjective exercise. So technically speaking, ITAT being the final fact-finding authority, it is within its purview to determine the ALP. There is no legal bar which I can think of. Having said that, it is generally very, very unusual for an ITAT to disregard assessee's ALP, to disregard TPO's ALP, and do its own method and put something. Because in such cases, what generally would happen is that they would remand the matter back for a proper adjudication by the lower authorities. So yes, while technically the tribunal can do ALP, and in many cases they have directed how the ALP should be done, But it is highly unusual for them to adopt a third method after striking down both the methods, especially in the manner in which the way they have done that.